Today I'd like to talk about help. In the corrections field, help is generally aligned by three factors: risk, need, and responsivity. And to some extent, this also applies in mental health. And what I'm really addressing today is responsivity, and I have addressed this in a review of the literature back in 2013 in my thesis. But I wanted to update it based on my own experience in recovery from complex post-traumatic stress, which is a form of trauma that children in situations where they're exposed to abuse and neglect learn to keep themselves safe in different ways and to cope with the trauma of that experience. And what we are aware of, and we have been aware of this for some time, is the link between people who go to prison repeatedly and complex PTSD. More recently, that's been publicised through the work of the Royal Commission into the Abuse in State and Faith-Based Care, and they produce volumes of evidence of survivors' stories of the experiences they had as children in care. And it's significant because these are relationships with authority figures, with a child who is pretty much has no real autonomy. They're dependent on an authority figure to feed them, to protect them, and to give them whatever attention that they can claim. And in institutions, that's usually quite a traumatic experience for kids. And a number of kids have been removed from homes because of other trauma within the family environment. And again, often generational trauma caused by, post-war trauma, depression, economic scarcity, mental illness, parents and grandparents who've also been through the care system, been abused, and have carried that abuse on. So it's a complex situation, but if we allow for the reality of what we're dealing with are people who are offending to as a response to their childhood trauma. So my experience in recovery from CPTSD is useful because in that process I experienced the mental health system, I experienced the police, and time after time there is a reinforcement of a attitude that there is something wrong with me and that they know how to fix it. And I can only say that my experiences in that system were much more traumatic than the psychosis that led me there. And that they also left me high and dry after taking away all my liberty. So I wanted to talk first about the physical environment. In my experience, I was held in an environment that wasn't dissimilar to a prison unit. And I know that because I worked in one. So the medical staff sat behind a glass, like a guard room, and the patients roamed around in this other area. And these are people who are there because they are disturbed and distressed and in danger to themselves or to others, but are roaming around with very little ability to protect themselves or to be able to isolate themselves because they feel um, unsafe. So, one of the examples of that was at night, if you needed to use the toilet, you had to leave your room unlocked and go across to a toilet door, which often didn't work, a lock that didn't work, and it it that whole scenario creates high levels of stress for someone who has been abused. Um, so that's one thing. So this expectation that people will feel safe with people they don't know in close physical proximity, having to share uh, bathrooms. And in prisons, we've got people having to share a very small cell, and we know that sometimes that ends in a death, like happened quite recently. The other aspect of that is that as an inmate, you have to ask permission to do the most basic of things, to go outside in fresh air, to use a telephone, to have a visitor, blah de blah. So these are all issues about the uh, the traumatized people having to have their needs subservient to the needs of the institution, presumably under the auspices of security. But in the case of prisons, that involves strip searching, internal searching, and more re-traumatization. And I find it very difficult to understand that in a technological age like we're in, that that is still the only way of ensuring that drugs and cell phones can't enter the prison. So, but part of that environmental issue is that in prisons we have a very low expectation about how people should expect to live. And in recent times, there has been a riot in one of our major prisons, and it was a very old prison where a number of people who actually hadn't been even pled, even been found guilty, so they were on remand, were being held in very austere situations, and they tried to uh, make changes to that through the ordinary complaints processes, and that was deliberately blocked. Um, so on this day, they rang the head office to ask for a meeting for how this could be changed, and we refused. And so they began to riot as a protest and lit fires. Now, the key issue here is the attitude of the leadership of these institutions is that instead of responding to a health and safety danger, that they left their own staff as well as prisoners, so 200 people left in toxic smoke conditions, in some cases open flames, for 6.5 hours before they made an order to evacuate. And that evacuation took some time. So that CEO was never held criminally responsible for that breach. He never fronted to the media after the review into the riot was carried out. And it that signals that there is a permission given for this kind of treatment of prisoners as less than human. And so people are subjected to a kind of regular attitude that you are less than. And this extends to the kind of help, rehabilitation that is provided. So in the psychiatric world, that help is pretty much limited to medication, which we know from people's going on and off again that it is not helpful to them. And the on and off again actually, because these are such strong drugs, actually creates more psychiatric issues. In the prison system, despite neuroscience research, the prison continues to only offer cognitive behavioural interventions and refuses to consider any trauma um, uh, root, the root of offending being early trauma, and perpetrates this by continually enforcing often quite unnecessary rules on people. And so that brings me to the last point, which is if we expect people to reintegrate, there should be a transition for the bulk of the offending population from high level of authority over to a gradual transition towards independence, so that when people are released, they already are making decisions for themselves on a day-to-day basis. But we are telling people what to do, we're restricting their freedom, we're um, telling them basically that you're a piece of shit, and then we're opening the prison doors and we're just letting people go and expecting them to behave differently. It's crazy stuff. And the same happens in the mental health system. You are locked up against your will, and then I was released with no money, no keys, no cell phone to my own devices. And it's it, it makes recovery much longer than it needs to be, and it it is neither of these systems are working, and yet we have a lack of imagination as a culture to do anything different. So these are my thoughts on these systems and areas where we could consider how we help differently.